Serving with you, sir. Thank you, Commissioner Werfel, for appearing before the Ways and Means Committee a little earlier than usual this year. We have a lot to go over with you, so I appreciate you answering the request of our members to come before the committee early this year. First, as it pertains to the current 2023 tax filing season, I want to thank you and your team for the technical work to ensure the quick and without delay implementations of provisions of the Tax Relief for American Families and Workers Act. We particularly appreciate the steps the agency is taking right now to be ready to immediately implement the legislation once the Senate passes the bill and it is signed into law, especially with regard to adjustments to the child tax credit. I think we are also largely aligned on the importance of rooting out fraud in the Employee Retention Tax Credit Program. We look forward to hearing about your efforts, not just in eliminating that fraud, but also making sure that small businesses across America who filed legitimate claims receive their credits as soon as possible. While I'm grateful for your partnership in these efforts, it won't surprise you that I also have a number of concerns about the Biden administration's approach to the IRS and about the IRS's handling of several important issues. Last time you were before this committee, the IRS had chosen to delay a provision of a law crafted by the Biden administration and congressional Democrats that would send tax forms to 44 million Americans just for engaging in transactions over $600 in a year. This includes transactions like simply selling a used couch or a concert ticket through a third-party payment platform. Once again, the IRS unilaterally chose to delay implementing the law or sending these forms, this time in an election year. To be clear, Republicans are united behind repealing this terrible policy, and I want to thank Representative Carol Miller for her leadership on the repeal effort. But the way to fix this terrible law is to repeal it, not to use the IRS to shield the Biden administration from the consequences of its own policies. Also, last time you were before this committee, you said the IRS would not retaliate against whistleblowers. One of the IRS whistleblowers who has appeared before this committee has since alleged the IRS retaliated against him for exposing the truth about the DOJ's preferential treatment of Hunter Biden. I hope you will share what steps have been taken to protect whistleblowers. And just a couple weeks ago, a judge sentenced an IRS contractor to 5 years in prison for the greatest theft of taxpayer information in American history. I think the Department of Justice woefully undercharged this individual, but I'm pleased the judge applied the maximum sentence available to her. But this story doesn't end with that case. The IRS must be accountable for allowing this theft to have ever happened and must ensure that it fixes security vulnerabilities at the agency. A recent report from the Inspector General described alarming details about how current IRS security flaws that demonstrate the problem has not been resolved. I hope that you will commit today to address their findings quickly for the sake of millions of taxpayers. We have serious questions about numerous other issues, such as the implementation of an IRS direct file scheme that the American people didn't ask for, how the IRS is spending its windfall of $80 billion, and Fantasyland claims about how much revenue the agency thinks it will generate from increased audits. Frankly, more of the IRS's time and resources should be directed toward improving its customer service for its existing duties, not spending money and resources on new systems no one has asked for. Part of that focus should be on deploying new technology to make the IRS more efficient. Proper use of technology can help avoid the need to hire thousands and thousands of new employees. I want to thank Representative Schweikert for leading the charge to ensure that the IRS is taking advantage of new technology to help taxpayers. Clearly, there is a lot the IRS needs to answer for, and I look forward to hearing how your agency plans to follow the law and protect taxpayers moving forward. I'm pleased to recognize Ranking Member Neal for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. So we want to welcome the Commissioner back to the Committee on Ways and Means. As always, it's delightful to have you with us in the middle of what promises to be another record-breaking filing season. The dedication of the employees of the Internal Revenue Service is remarkable. We want to thank them for their commitment to our taxpayers and fair tax administration, emphasis on the word fair, and for the swift implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. Last filing season was the first impacted by the Democrats' multi-year investment from this historic legislation. While taxpayer service was dramatically improved, it was merely the consequence of a well-laid, well-funded plan. The results have been quite remarkable. In this era of service to America's taxpayers, the IRS beat Secretary Yellen's goal and delivered an 87% quality level of service. 3 million more phone calls were answered, while wait times were cut from 28 minutes to 3 minutes. Over 140,000 additional taxpayers were served in person. The 222 backlog was eliminated, and many new digital tools were introduced to make taxpayer experiences even easier. A reminder to our Republican colleagues, many of the recommendations that we entertained and discussed this morning came from Commissioner Rettig, a Republican who worked with all of us to ensure quality service. We know that expectations have been increased based on the success that the IRS has had so far. It was just last year that we discussed the future of the IRS ability to hold the top 1% of tax cheats accountable, and in a matter of months, over $500 million has been recovered from 1,600 wealthy tax avoiders. Another major victory is taxpayer fairness and a victory for the IRS. A reminder, if the revenue is not collected in a fair manner, that means the rest of us pay more. Yet the biggest threat to the IRS right now is the extremism of some of our colleagues. From the government shutdown that looms in just 5 legislative days to our colleagues' attempt to gut our investments every chance they've gotten, not only would this end up costing taxpayers money and adding to the deficit, but how can you argue with the success? I find myself wondering out loud about who wins when the IRS is starved for its resources. Perhaps our colleagues will have a chance to answer that this morning. Under Republican funding cuts, the audit rate on millionaires fell by more than 70% from 2010 to 2019. Those are numbers from Commissioner Rettig. And the audit rate on large corporations fell by more than 50%. That was a request from Commissioner Rettig. Workers and their families pay their fair share, and the American people can count on us to ensure that wealthy and well-connected people are paying their fair share too. While the promise of direct file draws near, and I'm optimistic about some prospects, I'm disappointed it wasn't already in time for the public to take advantage of it. We want to thank the Commissioner for his diligence being here today. We look forward to continue work on behalf of the American people. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Neal. Today's sole witness is the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service, Daniel Werfel. The committee has received your written statement, and it will be made part of the formal hearing record. Commissioner Werfel, you may begin when you are ready.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the filing season and IRS operations. I am pleased to report that the 2024 filing season opened on schedule on January 29th and has gone smoothly so far. Along with filing season and other day-to-day operations, we continue to make important progress in our efforts to transform our agency through implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. Using IRA funding, our work is centered on 3 fundamental themes. First, ensuring taxpayers can easily contact the IRS, whether in person, on the phone, or online. We want them to get help navigating complex tax laws and accessing the credits they deserve. Second, identifying the growing number of taxpayers with complex returns including certain wealthy individuals, large corporations, and complex partnerships who are shielding income to evade their tax responsibility. We want to collect from them what is owed. And third, addressing the growing risk of tax scams and schemes by protecting honest taxpayers from them. We want to root out the nefarious actors that perpetrate them. These investments allow us to strengthen the overall effectiveness of IRS operations. As Commissioner, I want people to know that the IRS is on the side of taxpayers, and we are working to reflect that in every aspect of our operations while administering the nation's tax law. The IRS has been working hard to build on the accomplishments of last year. Our transformation goals for this filing season include providing an 85% level of service on our main toll-free phone line during the filing season. On the compliance side, we continue to increase scrutiny on those who evade taxes. We are working to reverse the historically low audit rates for large corporations, complex partnerships, and high-wealth individuals. During the past year, the IRS has also taken dramatic steps to strengthen our internal systems, protocols, and procedures by putting in place numerous improvements to bolster how we protect key systems and information. Our recent steps, enabled with new funding, have sharply reduced risks for taxpayers and the tax system. While taxpayers should rightfully be concerned about recent reports of the unauthorized access and disclosure that occurred in the 2017 to 2021 timeframe, the data security environment at the IRS is dramatically improved today. We have worked tirelessly this past year to close gaps that allowed this unfortunate event to transpire. However, there is always more work to do in this area, and we will continue our laser focus on strengthening data security. Another important aspect of our mission is implementing the tax laws fairly and justly. A key part of this involves making sure everyone pays the taxes they owe. But we also have a responsibility to protect taxpayers from being overly burdened in fulfilling their tax obligations. We work continuously to balance these two sides of the mission. This is the issue we faced in implementing the $600 threshold for 1099-K reporting that Congress passed in 2021. While it is important for us to have the information provided under the lower threshold, we must also consider the burden placed on taxpayers in meeting this requirement. Our administration of tax laws should be guided by what is best for taxpayers. In this situation, we delayed imposing the lower threshold because we realized that immediate implementation posed a high risk of taxpayers being confused and, given the complexities of the 1099 reporting, some potentially paying taxes they didn't actually owe. That is something we take very seriously, and we will do everything in our power to avoid. So the IRS is continuing to work to reduce that risk before imposing the $600 standard for business transactions. We will continue working this and getting feedback from key groups. I also want to assure the committee that the IRS is paying close attention to the potential passage of the child tax credit legislation. If Congress acts, the IRS is poised to move quickly to implement it. Building off our experience with economic impact payments during the pandemic, we may be able to start implementation as early as 6 to 12 weeks after passage, depending on the bill's final language. But taxpayers should not wait for this legislation to file their returns. We will take care of getting any additional refunds to taxpayers who have already filed. They won't need to take additional steps. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, and members of the committee, that concludes my statement. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll now proceed to the question and answer session. Commissioner Werfel, as you know, the House passed the Tax Relief for American Families and Workers Act, included adjustments to child tax credit. You just briefly touched on that. I want to ask some additional questions to make the record reflect appropriately. But the bill passed through this committee by a vote of 40-3, and it received 357 votes on the House floor. As I mentioned in my opening statement, I appreciate the work you and your team have done to help ensure that the bill can be implemented as quickly as possible. I just want to confirm a few details with you. The overwhelming majority of American taxpayers are guaranteed to have no adjustment to their tax liability due to the child tax credit changes in this bill. In fact, can you confirm that only roughly 10% of households will be effective and will receive just modest adjustments to their tax refunds?
Yes. In fact, in looking at the numbers, if you look at the same eligible population in fiscal year 22, it was about 22.5 million people. So that metric that you offered is in line with our understanding of how it's going to impact taxpayers going forward.
Thank you. We worked with your team to make sure the bill did not place a new burden on taxpayers and can be implemented without delay. Can you confirm that taxpayers do not need to file amended returns to obtain the adjustments the bill makes, further speeding things up?
Yes.
Thank you. There is language in the legislation requiring the IRS to process any additional returns without delay. As a matter of fact, that was language we added during the markup in this room. If the bill is passed by the Senate and signed into law, how quickly will you be able to make the child tax credit adjustments for this filing season? In other words, how long will it take after bill signage for the IRS to send out any additional refunds?
Well, we gave you a range of 6 to 12 weeks required for implementation from the point of enactment. The reason we give a range is because we need to see the final language, but I'm committed to work diligently to make sure we're closer to the 6-week end of that range than the 12-week.
I appreciate hearing that, Commissioner. So just to be clear, we have your commitment that the IRS will move as quickly as possible.
It will be a top priority to make sure that this gets done.
Thank you, sir. In the past, Congress has asked the IRS to make changes during tax filing season. In fact, Congress has asked the IRS to make much larger changes than this bill does, like sending stimulus checks to hundreds of millions of taxpayers, or creating a monthly check sending system for the child tax credit on the fly. The number of taxpayers affected here is a fraction of those affected in those other programs. Given that, can you confirm the administrative adjustments needed to implement the Tax Relief for American Families and Workers Act are a much lighter lift for the IRS than for those other programs?
Yes, and Mr. Chairman, the work that we did to implement the payments that you referred allowed us to build additional capacity to make us even more ready for this change.
Thank you, sir. Commissioner Werfel, the individual who stole and disclosed the tax information of thousands of Americans has now been punished with a sentence of 5 years in prison. While I'm glad the judge in the case sentenced him to the maximum available to her, I was surprised that the Department of Justice only charged the individual with one count of unauthorized disclosure and no other crimes. Did you make a recommendation to the Department of Justice on how to charge in this case?
No, that's not the role of the IRS Commissioner. We allow and defer to the Department of Justice on prosecutorial decisions.
Do you think one count of disclosure matches the crime committed?
I think that protecting taxpayer information from unauthorized access is an absolute solemn responsibility of the IRS. And I also believe that this individual betrayed the trust. He betrayed his own commitments. He betrayed IRS employees, and he betrayed the American tax people. And that type of betrayal should not be tolerated. And based on what's playing out in court, it's not being tolerated because this person is being brought to justice, and as I understand it, is going to spend years in prison.
5 years. Do you think the penalty should have been higher for this individual?
I don't have a judgment on that, Mr. Chairman. I rely on the court and the judicial process to play out, and I trust that the judicial process will get the right answer.
I was looking at more of the legislative process of whether Congress should change and increase the penalties for someone who abuses taxpayer information like this situation. I now recognize the ranking member for any questions he might have.
Thank you, Chairman. Commissioner, what's the IRS done to restore an element of fairness to the tax system, and are there any new compliance push that you are aware of to audit high-income earners and big corporations?
Yeah, thank you for the question. See, what happened in the period before the Inflation Reduction Act, when IRS funding was low and we weren't making the appropriate investments, is there's a variety of different areas we fell behind. And one of the key areas we fell behind is the ability to assess complex returns. So in situations where taxpayers had the means to hire an army of lawyers or an accountants to create a lot of complexity in their return and potentially shield income, we weren't making the appropriate investments to track that, assess it, and collect it. And now we are doing just that. With the Inflation Reduction Act resources, we are focused on building our capacity around how to deal with complex returns and how to make sure there's fairness. Because if you're a taxpayer who can't afford to hire a lawyer or an accountant to help you create complexity and shield your income, then you would likely be very frustrated if those that did have the resources could do that and evade what they owe. And we have to close that gap, and we're making really important progress already in closing that gap.
Thanks. And Commissioner, let's talk about data security. I thought your answer and your introductory comments was on target. You want to talk about data security and the improvements that have been made in your time as Commissioner?
Yeah, I mentioned how important, in the answer to Mr. Chairman's question, data security is to the IRS. It is fundamental to what we do in ensuring the public trust. When I got to the IRS, one of the first things I did in March of 2023 was pull the team in together and ask, what is the state of our data security environment? And what I learned was there were a lot of gaps. And one of the primary causes of those gaps was lack of investment. The underfunding that had occurred for many years at the IRS, I said, decreased our capacity in a variety of different ways. And one of those ways was to keep pace with investing in the type of technology, process change, controls to make sure that our environment was secure. And we have spent the last year working diligently to close those gaps. And there is a long laundry list of steps we have taken to completely dramatically change our environment. And I'll point out one important one. The Inspector General, in evaluating our security environment, pointed specifically to a lack of audit trails in our system so that we can see how data is moving throughout the organization and we can track and see if it's moving in an inappropriate way. I required, and it's now been implemented, that every sensitive system in the IRS has the very robust audit trails that the Inspector General required. Again, before the Inflation Reduction Act, we didn't have the resources to put in the work to close these gaps. And that's why it is so important that the IRS be funded adequately for its operations, not just so that we can answer the phone when people call us, not so that we can keep pace with complex returns, but we need to invest in our infrastructure and invest in our data security so events like what happened in 2017 to 2020, that doesn't happen again.
Yeah, I don't understand the logic that sometimes is offered that if we cut the IRS, then somehow we're going to improve compliance. The logic escapes me. So let me give you some time here. You've got 1 minute and 15 seconds to talk about some of the other additions to your testimony that you might like to offer.
Absolutely. So I really want to amplify this point about what a funded IRS means versus what it doesn't. And we have all the evidence we need in looking at the state of the IRS before the Inflation Reduction Act was passed versus where it is today. And before the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, our walk-in centers around the country were closed or understaffed with lines around the block. And now, just a few years later, we've opened 50 new walk-in centers. They're fully staffed. We're extending hours to Saturday for people who can't get to us during the week. And we're implementing what we call pop-up walk-in centers, going to remote populations. So if people want to see us in person, they now can. A second example is with the phones. We were understaffed by thousands of phone assisters because of underfunding. What did we do with the funding? We hired 5,000 phone assisters, put them in the call center, and between before the Inflation Reduction Act and after, there was a dramatic change in our ability to answer the phone and help taxpayers with their questions. And the same is true for digital. We have a whole generation of taxpayers that is going to expect, as they should, to be able to do everything they ever wanted to do with the IRS without calling us, without going into our walk-in centers. And before we were funded, our technology tools were stagnant. They weren't being updated in the way you would see either other tax jurisdictions around the world or in the financial services sector and the retail sector. That's all changing now. We have work to do, but now every time taxpayers come to be with the IRS and filling out their taxes or answering a question, when they go to our website each filing season, they're going to see a new set of tools, new functionality, new things that they can do without ever calling us or walking into a walk-in center, because we're investing and focusing our investments on how do we best serve taxpayers.